If you are ready to go deep and harness the full power and potential of astrology to shape change in your own life and the world around you, stay with me. My name is Alina, and I am the astrologer for creatives and change makers. And you are listening to Promethea Astrology. Today, we're talking about Venus. Venus is the planet of love, beauty, romance, harmony, sensuality, all of the fine, beautiful, feminine things. She is the second closest to the sun and one of the two benefics in astrology, the planets that want to do good, lovely things for us. What I'm going to do in this video is to get into the essential nature of who Venus is on the deepest, most archetypal, fundamental level. So I will not be going through this is what Venus in Aquarius means, this is what Venus in Scorpio means. Instead, I'm going to try to get abstract and dive into the most ancient and original and core essence of who Venus is. This way, I hope that you will be able to connect more personally and deeply to the symbols. It will never be as effective or transformative for you to simply listen to astrologers talk about this is what Venus means for you. It will be much more powerful for you to have a direct relationship with the symbol and be able to identify in your own life, oh, here's Venus showing up. Here's that aspect to my Venus. Here's this manifestation of what Venus wants to do for me in this moment. It would be as if you were, rather than having a translator in a foreign land able to converse with people directly there. You'll just be able to have a more profound experience as you interact in this new system, when you can relate deeply to the symbols in their essence. And you're also able to avoid the projections of other people when we go this route. Sometimes astrologers might have their own preconceived notions about this is what this sign is like, and I've had this experience with this type of person, and this is what it means that you have this. But when you can just get into the most abstract, essential nature of these symbols in astrology, then you can sort of sidestep the cultural perceptions that our current moment in time apply to these symbols. Because of course, throughout the course of human history, people have had different ideas about what is good, what is bad, what's acceptable, what's unacceptable, different ways of behaving that are celebrated or demonized. So when you get into the most core nature of these archetypal, astronomical, astrological symbols, then you can decide for yourself and see for yourself and avoid any current individual or cultural projections that people have about these different aspects of human nature and of human life. Because ultimately, nothing is just good and nothing is just bad. And so much of the cultural weight that is carried will have those projections onto it, but everything has two sides. There's two sides to every coin. So Venus's significations, in general, what Venus means. Venus is your style of love and romance, your aesthetic. She is relational love. This could be friendship or also romantic. She is sensuality, sexuality, all of the finer things in life, and earthly pleasure, dance, music, art, architecture, anything that is meant to be experientially pleasing is something that Venus would rule over. This could also be relationships with other humans. Venus is associated with desire, attraction, magnetism, that feeling that intense beauty has that can just call you in and grip you. Venus does not go forth boldly and take what she wants. No, Venus is simply radiating beauty and desire that pulls in what she is looking for. Venus is receptive and magnetic. Venus is also harmony and peace, balance, relaxation, softness. Venus is also associated with money and can represent in her placement and aspects what your relationship to money might be like, as another sort of embodiment of earthly material pleasures that can afford you these finer things in life. In the Greek pantheon, Venus would be Aphrodite. the goddess of love, beauty, romance, desire, procreation. Venus can also be associated with fertility. Venus's beneficence. It could be helpful to understand what it means that Venus is a benefic in astrology. So in traditional astrology, they talk about benefics and malefics. These are the planets that either want to do more helpful, constructive things for you or represent more challenges and hardship in your life. So Mars and Saturn are the two malefics that want to do hard, challenging things. You can watch my videos about those planets if you're interested. And then we have Venus and Jupiter, which are the two benefics. So it could be helpful to contrast Venus and Jupiter in the nature that they have of being benefic. What is the difference? They both want to do good things, but they want to do different styles of good things. So Venus, as I said, is all of these kind of earthly, sensual pleasures, feminine planet, Aphrodite. Jupiter, on the other hand, is a masculine planet and has more to do with good fortune, abundance, good luck, justice, joy, optimism. So in a way, Jupiter is more abstract in a sense. As a masculine planet, he has more to do with these kind of higher ideals, these heady concepts of justice and God, and also judgment and luck and fortune. These things are not so tangible. Venus, as a feminine benefic, is much more in the material world, the earthly pleasures, things that feel good in your body. As far as Venus's astronomy, Venus is the second closest planet to the sun, starting with Mercury, then Venus, then Earth. Venus is our closest neighbor. So when you look out into the sky, Venus looks like the brightest star in the sky, but she's not always visible. So because Venus is closer to the sun than we are, and quite close to the sun in general, she can never be, this is just the way the astronomy and the orbital positions and everything works out, she can never be in the zodiac more than 48 degrees away from the sun. That would mean that your Venus sign is always going to be either the same as your sun sign, one sign away from your sun sign on either side, or maximally two signs away on either side. And I talked about this concept of being under the beams of the sun in one of my previous videos on Mercury that I will link here, because Mercury, being the closest to the sun, can actually never be more than one sign away. So Mercury will always be either the same sign as your sun sign or one sign away. But Venus can be up to two signs away because she's a little bit further from the sun. But when you are quite close to the sun as a planet in the sky, as a star, the sun is extremely bright, very bright, brightest thing out there. So when a planet becomes within 15 degrees of the sun, this is called under the beams of the sun, then you can no longer see that planet because it is washed out by the brightness of the sun. So in astronomy or astrology, we call Venus being up to 46, 48 degrees away from the sun her maximum elongation period. This will be when she is the brightest, most visible star in the sky. And Venus can either be a morning star or an evening star in this way. So if Venus is maximally on this side of the sun, maybe a morning star, and if Venus is maximally on this side of the sun, then she'll be an evening star. And when she gets very close to the sun here, then this would be when she is sort of washed out under the beams of the sun. And then Venus directly conjunct the sun would be a Venus cazimi. So if Venus is ahead of the sun, then you will see her in the morning before the sunrise. Well, it's still dark in the early morning because she can never be too far from the sun. Or if Venus is after the sun, then she will come out after sunset and be an evening star. And this has to do with which side of the sun in zodiacal order Venus is on at any given point. So in very, very ancient times, people actually did not realize that Venus was one star. They thought that she was two different stars, either a morning star, this was a different star, or an evening star, not the same Venus. But I believe the Babylonians and the Mesopotamians worked out that actually Venus is the same star. And this is kind of difficult to do if you can imagine ancient times without all of the equipment and technology that we have just through observation. Realizing that this is actually the same star all along would be kind of confusing to figure out. So there's this very ancient myth of Inanna, and this is a 4,000-year-old myth where people had this story of Venus. And at this point, she was not called Venus, she was called Inanna, the goddess Inanna. And by the time the Greeks came around and assigned Venus to be Aphrodite, she was just the goddess of love, romance, beauty, harmony, all these things. But back 1,000 or 2,000 years prior to this, Venus as Inanna was actually not only the goddess of love and peace and beauty, but also the goddess of war. And whether or not she was more of the war goddess or the love goddess depended on whether or not she was a morning or evening star. And the mythology that goes along with this is called the myth of Inanna. So this is a very interesting mythology that you can look at your birth chart with and start to see where your Venus is in this cycle to sort of apply what style of Venus might be integrated into the fabric of who you are. So the way the story goes is that Inanna, goddess in the sky, descends into the underworld. She's going to her sister's husband's funeral, I believe. So this would be the evening star version of Inanna, of Venus. So if you were born when Venus is an evening star, when she comes out after sunrise, when she is behind the sun, then you would have this more kind of innocent, pure, young, uninitiated, almost childlike love of beauty and harmony and romance that has this almost naive tinge to it. It's a purity. It's a Venus that has not seen darkness yet, that has not been initiated, that is the brightest light in the night sky before she's seen death in the underworld. So this would be if you were born with Venus in the maximum elongation period. So if your Venus is about over 40 degrees between this 40, maximally 48, 46 degrees away from your sun, then you were born when Venus was at her peak power. This could be on either side of the sun, but if she was an evening star, then it would be this beginning of the myth phase of Venus, where she is in her Venusian, her Inanna goddess realm, and has not yet been to the underworld, has not yet been initiated. But either way, if you're born with this maximum elongation period, then you do have sort of peak Venusian power. So you might be particularly beautiful, you might have a particular gift or talent for the arts, maybe visual, music, dancing, something like this. When Venus is very far from the sun, then she is the brightest, the strongest, peak power. So that's something to look out in your birth chart for. So then the myth goes, she decides to go to the underworld, and as she gets closer to the sun is sort of the symbolic representation of the underworld here, because as she gets closer to the sun, you can no longer see her in the night sky. So in the mythology, this would be Inanna descending into the underworld and essentially losing power. The story goes that she had to pass through these 7 gates, and at each gate she had to relinquish a piece of clothing, jewelry. She ends up in the underworld naked and essentially powerless, and she does in fact die here. And this would be if you were born with Venus under the beams of the sun, or in this Kazemi place where Venus is in the heart of the sun. That would be a version of Venus that is in the darkness, a Venus that is not scared of the taboo, the occult, the underworld, a Venus that is up against those more challenging things in this mythology. But Venus, or Inanna, in the mythology, did have a plan for when she got to the underworld. If she were to die and not make it back, she had a plan for someone to come save her and replace her with someone else so that she could return back to the earth, to the other godly realms. So this transpires and she does make it back out, and this would be when Venus is emerging on the other side of the sun. So after this Kazemi, after this conjunction, after Venus emerges from under the beams of the sun like this, she becomes instead a morning star. So now Venus is coming up before sunrise. So if you have the morning star version of Venus, then this would be the Venus who has been through it, who has died and been reborn, who has seen the dark, deep underworld and come back in this more mature, but also empowered, but also a little bit darker. Like now we have more of the war goddess version of Inanna on this morning star side of things, as far as this ancient 4,000-year-old myth goes. So Venus emerges, or Inanna emerges, and finds her husband completely unbothered, living it up happily on her throne, living large, not even concerned that his wife has been gone, not trying to find her, not seemingly missing her, and this makes Inanna very angry. So she comes back and she sees her husband like this and condemns him to be her replacement in the underworld, and the demons drag him down, and he's then stuck in the underworld, where she is now able to ascend back to her throne. And she becomes the goddess of war, Inanna. So this would be a different version of the maximum elongation period of Venus as an evening star. So if you check that out in your birth chart, this would be a very different type of still maximally strong Venusian energy, where you still probably have all of that beauty and gift and aesthetic, but it's this more kind of mature, integrated, but also somewhat dark, potentially even vengeful style of Venus slash Inanna. But then eventually in the mythology, Inanna does sort of come around and get lonely, starts to miss partnership and her husband, and then in this astronomy would be when Venus is returning back towards the sun again, and essentially the myth starts over again, and Venus goes through this cycle. And this is the story, the mythology, the 4,000-year-old myth that maps onto the Venus Synodic Cycle, and the way that you can interpret it in your birth chart by looking at how close is Venus to your sun? Is she on the left or right side of your sun? And this is how you can work out which stage of Venus is integrated into your being through this mythology. But many astrologers do not actually really look into mythology or even think about this too much. You can also just take Venus sort of at face value without mapping the myths on. You could play around, see if it works for you, see if it seems resonant. You can look at the charts of other people as well and their phases and talk to them and see, does this really work? Is this mythology still relevant 4,000 years later? Does it seem like it's applying to people? Play around with it. So as far as the light and shadow sides of Venus, we've already sort of gotten into that a little bit. With this myth of Inanna, we see Venus as the goddess of war or peace in a way. Although in modern times, Venus is not associated with war. That would be more like Mars. But even looking at Aphrodite, we can see that as a benefic, Venus is all of these things that are subjectively very pleasant and lovely to encounter, to experience love and beauty and peace and relaxation and harmony and all of the sensual, earthly pleasures. This is such a lovely thing to encounter, and too much of a good thing. So Aphrodite, we can look at, could sometimes be vain, could sometimes be maybe a little manipulative, could sometimes be a little bit vengeful when slighted. We see this in Inanna as well. So Venus is extremely powerful, this love, this beauty, this harmony, this sensuality, but that doesn't necessarily need to be used for good or evil. And in modern day culture in America, I can speak to America mostly as an American, we actually sort of demonize these things. Christianity, for instance, is considering most Venetian qualities to be sinful. Things like earthly pleasures and lusts. These are things that take you off the spiritual path. So it depends on how you look at Venus. Venus's quality in its own nature is not intrinsically good or bad. Like, it is a benefic, it is in astrology, when we're looking at aspects and placements and things, going to indicate probably parts of your life and personality that are where you experience more ease and good fortune or gifts. And nothing is just good and nothing is just bad. So the shadow side of Venus can be a little bit manipulative, can be a little bit shallow, a little bit vain. So let's look at Venus in the zodiac. Here is this lovely zodiac graphic that I made that includes all of the signs. On the outer edge here, we see the name of each sign, and then we see the symbol, the glyph, the planetary rulership, and in English, the name of the planet, whether or not each sign is cardinal, fixed, or mutable, the quadruplicity, then the element, and whether or not the sign is feminine or masculine. So this is a super helpful, super powerful graphic that I highly recommend that you download. It's available on my website for free, will be very useful for your astrological learning to refer back to. The amount of symbolism that is laden in the geometry of this framework is incredible. It will take a very long time to fully and deeply understand all of the symbolism that is integrated into this symbol. So, highly recommend that you take a download here. So, Venus. We see here Venus. This is the little symbol for Venus. Rules Taurus and also rules Libra. So, what does that mean? What does it mean for a planet to rule a zodiac sign? In ancient times, I'm a Hellenistic astrologer, so I like to look back at the ancient understandings, and I find that their conceptualizations are just much more cohesive and coherent and intuitive to understand. So, the way that ancient astrologers understood the zodiac and astrology and the night sky was that it was like its own world. So, each of the zodiac signs is like its own kingdom. And the different kingdoms have their own cultures, they have their own ways of being, they have their borders. This is the boundaries of each sign, and they have their own kings or queens. And each of the planets in astrology are like the wandering characters that traverse around the sky world, and each of them is king of one or two of these different kingdoms, or queen in this instance. Venus is a feminine planet. So the planetary ruler of a sign is essentially the more kind of abstract core essence of who that sign is. So each sign is essentially an embodiment of its planetary ruler. So Libra is the cardinal air version of Venus, and Taurus is the fixed earth version of Venus. Each in their nature an embodiment of Venus, but one masculine, Libra, one feminine, Taurus. Each planet has both a masculine and feminine sign that it is ruler of, and they will have different elemental qualities as well. So let's get into these two different sides of Venus in the zodiac. Starting with Taurus. I think Taurus is a little bit easier to understand as an embodiment of Venus because Taurus is the feminine version of Venus, and Venus is a very feminine planet. So, fixed Earth version of Venus. Taurus tends to be very much into earthly sensual pleasures. Taurus loves being cozy. Taurus loves food. Taurus loves the finer things in life. Taurus could be a little bit bougie as well. Taurus is the bull. We can think of the relationship with food in this way, where you think of cows grazing, you think of even cows as food and producing food, and also this kind of slow, steady nature of the bull or the cow. But I suppose Taurus is not exactly a cow. Taurus is the bull. And the bull has much more of this maybe energy sometimes that he can bring to things as needed. So as a fixed earth sign, Taurus can sometimes be a little bit stubborn. This is also the nature of the bull, being the most grounded, slowest moving of all the signs. Earth is going to be the slowest element, and of the cardinal fixed or immutable, fixed is going to be the most stable and slow as well. So that's sort of where sometimes people talk about Taurus being a little bit stubborn. There also is an association with money and Taurus. People love to talk about Taurus and their spending habits, maybe liking to spend a lot sometimes or on things that are maybe not super necessary, but it's Venus. We need the finer things. You need the nice food. It's worth it to have the more comfort. As an earth sign, Taurus can also be very into gardening sometimes and enjoying the pleasure of being outdoors in nature, surrounded by flowers or food and beauty. These are all sort of Taurus versions of Venus. And then on the other side, we have Libra. Libra ruled by Venus. This is a very different version of Venus, masculine version of Venus, cardinal air, an air sign. So Libra is the scales and has more of this association of kind of the social component of Venus. So Venus is not only material pleasure, but also relational pleasure. So Libra has this superpower of really being able to induce peace and ease in their social interactions. Libra is very skilled at navigating social situations to make everyone feel at ease. Libra knows how to not rock the boat too much, how to keep the peace. Libra tends to be very concerned with justice and fairness as well as the scales, as the more masculine version of Venus, and also has sort of an aesthetic intelligence. Air signs are more mental, social, playful, and I think of Libra as sort of the archetype of the interior designer. They tend to have very strong sense of oftentimes even lighting specifically, but also just the general environment that they're in, interior design, architecture, and art. They tend to have an aesthetic, and that's important to them. On the shadow side of Libra, sometimes this ability to really sense what would be the most harmonious and having this very strong orientation towards relational peace. Sometimes it can be hard for Libra to say a hard thing, to set a boundary, to assert themselves in situations. Sometimes they might even find themselves sort of getting a little bit walked all over or played in a way because they are trying to be so nice and so kind that sometimes people can even take advantage of them sometimes. And they may not have the inclination or fortitude to stick up for themselves in a moment. Also very hard for Libra to make a decision. Sometimes being the scales and having this intense or can be intense inclination towards fairness can make it difficult for them to just make a decision, to decide, okay, what's the thing we need to do? Because they can be weighing the pros and cons. Well, like there's the benefit of this and there's the benefit of that. And they just really, they like to think and make sure that everything, they've considered all of the pros and cons. So sometimes decision making can be hard for Libra people. It can also be extremely insightful to understand the planets through their opposites. So if you look at the zodiac wheel, you'll notice that Venus is always opposite to Mars in the Aries-Libra axis and in the Taurus-Scorpio axis. This is the feminine axis of Mars-Venus, Scorpio feminine, Taurus feminine, and Aries-Libra is the masculine axis of Venus-Mars. Aries masculine, Libra masculine. And this is true for all of the planets in here. So Jupiter is always opposite to Mercury in the Pisces Virgo and in the Sagittarius Gemini axis, one feminine, one masculine, and Saturn is always opposite to a luminary, either the sun or moon. Masculine axis, Aquarius, Leo, feminine axis, Capricorn, Cancer. So this is meaningful. They are always opposite because they have opposite energy. They want to do opposite things. So Venus is a benefic, love, beauty, harmony, romance, aesthetics, all of these lovely things. Mars is a malefic, wants to split, sever, destroy, explode, pierce, separate, inflammation, anger, aggression, violence. This is Mars. Mars is also probably our manliest man of the zodiac planets, and Venus is our most feminine femme of the planets. So they are very opposite in this gendered way. Mars is very essentially masculine and Venus is very essentially feminine. So the way that this works out, we can start with the Libra Aries axis here. I think of this axis as the axis of war and peace. Aries is the most archetypal warrior of the zodiac, very much an embodiment of Mars. Mars is fiery, and this is a fire sign. Aries is masculine. Aries is very much the energy that Mars wants to be in. Cardinal fire, I think of Aries as like a machine gun. The hero. You could think of Aries as the archetype of the hero as well. And then Venus over here with Libra, the scales, justice, harmony, peace, social relating. So this is really the axis of war and peace, which is not to say that just because Libra is ruled by Venus, all Libras are great, and because Aries is ruled by Mars, all Aries people are gonna be violent and suck or something. There's two sides to every coin, and both Mars and Venus are extremely important energies to have integrated and to understand and to not demonize, because they both get demonized for different reasons. So as lovely as it is to encounter Venusian qualities, to have this social harmony, this peace, this relaxation, this beauty. The opposite end of that is Aries in their bravery, an ability to set boundaries, speak their mind, to say no, to get out there and do a hard thing, to endure discomfort. This is also a very important quality for people to have integrated. So on sort of the shadow side of Libra, when we think about the Libra Aries axis, you can think about Mars also as being sort of the archetype of bravery. And in this opposite sense for Venus can be a little bit, maybe cowardly is too strong of a word, but there's sort of a lack of bravery. It can be very difficult for Libra to socially do a hard thing, to have that social bravery, whereas Aries, gonna be much easier for them to speak up even if you don't like what they have to say, and maybe that might make them a little bit difficult for you to be around, but that's important for them to be able to do and puts them in situations where they're around people that are aligned, because they're able to just say how they really feel and what they really think. So of course, on the flip side, sometimes Aries might rush to be a little bit rash, might tend towards a little bit anger, might come off a little bit stronger than they need to, maybe lack some of this social harmony ability that is also super useful that you're going to need. So it's not that it's just good or just bad. Sometimes Aries really do need to chill. Sometimes they do need to think about the social situation and how they can sort of be at ease with that, because that could be much more constructive for them sometimes, even though it might be difficult for them to not just say what they think in a situation, which is going to be more of the superpower of Libra. Libra really knows how to navigate in that way, which is very useful as well. So again, not to just demonize one side or the other, just to know that there's this polarity that exists. And interestingly, like I was talking about earlier with the myth of Inanna, 4,000 years ago, Venus was both of these things. And you can always think of any two opposites as two sides of the same coin. This is a Taoist idea that duality is an illusion. And although you think that there are two sides, really there is just one coin. The other axis, the feminine axis now, we have Scorpio and Taurus. So this is a very different version of Mars, a very different style of axis. So this is a fixed water version of Mars. So water, again, more oriented towards emotions, feeling, intuition. Not so much the qualities that Mars on his own is really more inclined towards. So the way this works out is Scorpio is sort of more like the archetype of the sniper, where as a fixed water sign, this version of Mars is much more patient. Scorpio can really just wait for the exact right moment to strike. It's still that warrior energy of Mars, but it's much more calculated and strategic, not so front lines blasting forward, more like, they have wronged me. That will never happen again. And I will wait as long as I need to wait for the exact right moment to take them down. That's more of the Scorpio version of Mars. And sometimes this ends up being a little bit more in the emotional realm, where sometimes Scorpio people can maybe hold on to grudges, for instance, as something that they get associated with as a fixed water sign. That's kind of like holding fixed emotions, water, fixed water sign. And they also tend to really like to go deep. Water has this inclination towards depth and really wanting to get underneath the surface. So for Scorpio, this can sometimes be psychological, really liking to go deep in relationships, liking to go deep with people, but it can also be going deep into their interests, unafraid of the occult and the taboo, the hard things. They're not afraid to look at any of that and are quite interested in that. And really it can kind of go down a rabbit hole for a long time. They also tend to be a little bit more pessimistic sometimes, a little bit darker, really not a fan of small talk, not a fan of anything shallow. And that depth, that water quality of depth combined with Mars and the energy of intensity gets this emotional intensity sometimes with Scorpio. And on the other side, Taurus, of course, we already talked about, just wants to feel good, just wants to have a nice time. So I think of this axis as, whereas Aries-Libra is kind of war and peace, this is sort of the axis of depth versus shallow. So Scorpio wants to get super deep, look at the hard taboo underworld occult, and is unafraid in this Martian kind of bravery to do that. Whereas Taurus likes the comfort and safety of the familiar. Let's just feel good, relax. Like, we don't need to get into all of that. That just sounds kind of uncomfortable. We could just be chilling. That's more of Taurus type of energy on their own. And also, of course, understand that no one is just one thing. Like, if you have a Scorpio sun or a Taurus sun, that doesn't mean that you were just that. Like, every single person has all 7 of these different traditional planets in different places in their chart. You're going to have more than just one archetypal energy. So think of this not as Taurus people, but Taurus as the abstract, most archetypal energy of Taurus on its own, because the human manifestations that we see in our friends and family and people in the world are never just one thing. They're never just Mars. They're never just Taurus. They are always a complex amalgam. So we can't reduce people to these qualities or make stereotypes, because there's always going to be a lot more going on in each chart, in each person. So keep that in mind. So on the shadow side of Taurus Scorpio axis, for Taurus and Venus in this way, could be maybe somebody who is a little bit shallow, maybe a little bit basic, could even be a tiny bit vain, maybe doesn't really have the bravery to try new things or go into uncharted territory. Whereas those are all things that Scorpio is going to be very strong at. Scorpio's like, let's get into it. Let's get uncomfortable. Let's get into the unknown. I want to go there. And then on the more positive side of this for Taurus, of course, Taurus is going to just have a beautiful, lovely time and be enjoying their life. They know what they like and they don't have a problem with that. Whereas Scorpio, sometimes could maybe need to chill a little bit. Sometimes that could be helpful for Scorpio to just relax and take it easy and not have to be so intense all the time, just as an idea. Again, all of this is just to illustrate the nature of Venus through her opposite. So we get to understand all of the different sides of Venus in this multifaceted, multivalent archetypal symbol of astrology. And then we can look at Venus's exaltation in Pisces. So what exaltation means essentially, here we go, Pisces. Venus is exalted here. What this means is that Venus has an especially good time here. Venus really enjoys Pisces energy and can kind of reach her highest point. This is what exaltation means in the etymology, is to sort of be elevated in some way to the highest degree, potentially. So Pisces is ruled by Jupiter. This is another benefic. So benefics, sort of get along. So it makes sense that Venus would be very happy in Jupiter's sign of Pisces. Also, Pisces is sort of the archetype of the artist, also the mystic. So Pisces is also very concerned with beauty, creativity, harmony, peace, justice, and also love, but even in this more kind of divine love, as it's a watery sign that has more of this kind of mystical, intuitive nature to it. But all of these qualities are things that Venus also enjoys. So the detriment of Venus is going to be opposite to Pisces in Virgo. So the detriment is opposite to the exaltation, pretty much. Venus in Virgo, so this is going to be a place where she does not have a great time. Virgo, being ruled by Mercury, is more about what makes sense, what is rational, how do we make this just work? Which Venus is like, well, no, we need to make it pretty. But Mercury is like, it doesn't matter what it looks like, let's just, analyze, figure out what makes sense, put it together, and boom. Which is a very important energy, but just not really the style that Venus wants to take for things. So a Venus in Virgo just has this more analytical, potentially even critical nature that is a little bit antithetical to what Venus wants to do, which is not to say that if you have Venus in Virgo, then you will not be an artist or something. It's just maybe a little bit quirky, a little bit of a different style. Venus also has her joy in the 5th house. So the 5th house has to do with creativity, fertility, children, sensuality, and these are all things that Venus really loves. This is in traditional astrology called the place of good spirit. So this is just an excellent place for Venus to be in your chart. Will probably just give you more of that superpower creative energy because Venus is in a place that she is really enjoying and supportive to her nature. So these are just different ways that we can sort of look at the condition of Venus in your chart. So if she's in her domicile in Taurus or Libra, or if she's exalted in Pisces, these are called conditions of bonification, or things that are going to support and sort of make Venus stronger. Also, like at the beginning when I talked about Venus being in her maximum elongation, this is another supportive quality of Venus being very strong versus Venus being under the beams of the sun. This would be a condition of maltreatment or a more difficult place for Venus to be because she is being sort of washed out by the brightness of the sun. And, you know, in her detriment, also going to be a little bit more challenging. But there's many different conditions of bonification and maltreatment that we can look at. It is very rare that a planet is just in the absolute worst case scenario, terrible position, or in the very best case scenario, just everything is good. Usually there's a little bit of a mix of both, so don't be afraid. So having Venus in the 5th house is just another condition of bonification, a situation where Venus will be very happy because she's in a place that supports her nature and does the types of things that she wants to do. So getting into how to interpret Venus in a birth chart, you can look at all of these different things that I just said in terms of the quality and strength that you have in regards to aesthetics, beauty, creativity, romance, relating, things like that. So you can look at the sign that she's in to sort of look at not only your style of relating, your aesthetic. So if you had Venus in Pisces, for instance, you might be more inclined towards an artistic ideal and aesthetic that is related to these more mystical, deep, justice-oriented types of qualities. Or if you had a Venus in Aries, then you might have a style of relating to people or aesthetic that's much more fiery and passionate, or even assertive or aggressive. Or so you might embody that in your relationships. That might be the style of passion and romance that you bring to a relationship, or it could also be what you are attracted to in other people, that you are attracted to Aries type of energy in the world around you, in people or works of art or what have you. Something I think is super interesting too as an interpretive principle for Venus is that each of the zodiac signs actually corresponds to a different body part. So I'll pull up a graphic of that. Okay, so here is the little graphic that has each of the zodiac signs and which body they sort of correspond to. So Aries, the head; Taurus, the mouth, the throat; Gemini, the shoulders, arms, hands; Cancer, the breasts; Leo, the heart; Virgo, the stomach; Libra, the hips; Scorpio, the genitals; Sagittarius, the thighs; Capricorn, the knees, the joints, the bones; Aquarius, sort of the legs; and Pisces, the feet. So sometimes you might notice that people tend to actually have physical attraction to these different body parts depending on what sign their Venus is in. So for instance, a person who has a Taurus Venus might be attracted to people's mouths particularly, or the lips. So this is some more spicy astrology that you can look into if you're interested in that. You can also look at how you relate to money through your Venus sign. So depending on the aspects and the sign, what your relationship to money might be like, your artistic aesthetic, your style of romance and relating, and again, even sexual attraction here. Also, the house placement that Venus is in could be a place that you have particular gifts in, especially if you have a night chart. In a night chart, Venus is the more benefic of the two planets. That is the sect that Venus prefers, so she's just stronger at night. And during the day, Jupiter is the stronger of the two benefics. Jupiter prefers the daytime. He's stronger in the daytime. So especially if you have a night chart, then where Venus is placed could be an area of life that you have gifts in with regard to the house topics relating to that area. So for instance, if you have Venus in the 11th house, this is the place of friendship, alliances, hopes, and dreams. So maybe you might be someone who has an easier time making friends or something like that. And then lastly, to talk about transits a little bit, because Venus is closer to the sun than the earth, she travels through each sign pretty quickly. So when we're looking at Venus transits, where Venus is in the sky right now and how it relates to your birth chart, we often as astrologers don't really look at which sign she's passing through because it's only for maybe 18 days. It's very brief, the amount of time that she spends in each sign. So the conjunctions as she moves around are not as significant as when Venus goes retrograde. So every year or two, Venus will start to walk backwards in the sky. This is very significant. Oftentimes during a Venus retrograde period, you might experience people from your past, like your exes, for instance, coming back into your life. Can also be friendships, but oftentimes because Venus is very much relating to romance and relationships in this way, it can bring up people from the past that you've had relationships with. And sometimes the Venus retrograde periods also can sort of spur, both in the collective and in your own life, sort of taboo or risque, generally less acceptable socially, romantic sexual behaviors can come up during Venus retrograde. And this will depend on the sign that she's going through, but when Venus is retrograde, then she's spending much longer periods of time in whatever part of the zodiac it is that she is retrograding through. Oftentimes, this will also be times that are more difficult in people's relationships. When a planet starts to move backwards or go retrograde, that is sort of doing counterproductive or opposite things to what that planet would normally be doing if it was moving forward. So we get this kind of more both backwards looking, going into the past, because the planet is literally walking through degrees that they had been previously at a point in the past, and also working in opposite or antithetical ways to their nature and what it would normally be. So in Venus's instance, that would be things relating to relationships, sensuality, sexuality, beauty, aesthetics, things like that. Something very fascinating about the Venus retrograde cycle is that each time she goes retrograde, it happens in roughly the same exact places. Not exactly, it does shift a little bit each time, but she goes retrograde in the shape of this 5-pointed star. There's a Venus retrograde in sort of this pentagram shape that happens, and it just repeats through this. And about every 8 years, Venus will be retrograde in the exact same spot that she was in 8 years prior. So this is a super fascinating cycle to look at. Oftentimes people will break up when they reach the return of Venus in this synodic cycle, this 8-year cycle. A lot of times 8 years in a relationship will be sort of a breaking point because we are returning to that original point from the origin of the relationship in the relationship planet's cycle. So this is super interesting to look at in the world around you and in your own relationships. And it's not even necessarily just relationships. You could also look at this with regard to your artistic or creative endeavors, how maybe there could be sometimes these 8-year cycles that we experience creatively. And maybe at that point, we either renew our commitment to that aesthetic, or maybe we break away from that and start a new sort of creative endeavor or style. This is often a make or break point in anything related to Venus's topics of rulership. And if you have a Venus retrograde in your birth chart, then you will probably be especially impacted by Venus retrogrades, and you will probably very much be feeling these sorts of things happening during Venus retrograde periods. Sometimes if you're born in a retrograde period, that can actually be a more constructive time period for you, whereas for most people, if you're born with the Venus direct, then a Venus retrograde period could be working opposite to your own Venusian nature. But if you were born with a Venus retrograde, then the Venus retrograde periods might be more in alignment with your Venusian nature. So sometimes that can actually be much more constructive for people. So that's something to look at. If your Venus has a little white line over the planet, I guess it's not necessarily white, just like a little curved line. That's what the retrograde symbol is. Or a lot of times the different apps that you might calculate your birth chart with will probably tell you which planets were retrograde. So that's super interesting to look at because it's fairly rare. It is not super likely that you'll be born under a Venus retrograde. And then especially if you were, whatever that period is, when Venus returns there every 8 years, then that's probably going to be a super big deal for you. So you definitely want to look out for that in terms of transits that you watch out for. And then I already talked about the Synodic cycle relating to the Venus Cazimi and being under the beams with the myth of Inanna. So you can go back to that section to look at that version of interpreting Venus transits within your own chart and in the world around you. So for instance, I was talking about how Venus under her maximum elongation period is the sort of strongest point for Venus to be, because that is when she is the brightest in the sky. And of course, astrology is symbolic interpretation from our visual experience here on Earth. The way that the planets look to us is how we make meaning out of them in astrology. So when we're looking at the planet Venus and seeing that she is the brightest in the sky, this is the maximum elongation period, that symbolically, hopefully intuitively, you can see would indicate that she is sort of at her peak. So if you were an artist or a creative or something, and you are looking to maybe have an exhibition or an event or make a work of art, and you want that full maximum Venus power energy, you might look at her cycle and see when is she going to be in her maximum elongation period. This could be something useful to look into if you were trying to plan your life around Venus's cycles and strength. And I think that is pretty much it. Definitely drop your comments below if you have any about anything that I have talked about, or if you want to drop a little interpretation if you were born under Venus retrograde, maybe let us know how that worked out for you. Or if you're resonating with some interpretive principle, let us know. We can start learning from each other how we can interpret these different aspects of Venus's nature. Maybe if you were born under a maximum elongation period, if you calculate the number of degrees between your sun and Venus, let us know if you were born either in that Cazimi period. Does that resonate? If you were born in that maximum elongation period, does that resonate? If you were born with Venus under the beams, are you feeling that more kind of like shadow Venus, underworld Venus energy? This would all be very interesting for us to know. So let us know so we can learn together in the comments. And I actually am an artist and a jeweler, and I made these earrings. So I'll link below if you want to buy these earrings or other earrings from me. Love Venus, love adornment. And of course, I am an astrologer. I offer astrology consultations, either 60 minutes or 90 minutes if you would like some help facilitating your experience, your relationship with these symbols, some guidance and conversation around what might be your purpose, the strengths and weaknesses, challenges and triumphs that you might experience. The 60-minute reading is more getting into the symbol of who you are, strengths, challenges, purpose, things like that. And then the 90-minute consultation is more about timing, where I start applying lots of these ancient Time Lord techniques to get into when you might experience career peaks, what transits are going to be affecting you the most in the coming year, when you might encounter or have encountered what will become the focus of your life's work, things like that. So if any of that sounds interesting, book a consultation with me below. And of course, download my Zodiac graphic if you would like. That's super useful for learning astrology. And you can check out the other videos that I have in this series if you would like to keep going on this journey. I have a video out for each of the planets, or if you're listening to this at the time that I'm releasing it, then maybe not yet, but I certainly will have all of the planets out soon. And I'm also going to be going through each of the zodiac signs, the elements, the gender, the houses, the aspects. So if you would like to follow along with me on this journey or just support my work, please subscribe to my channel, like this video, it really helps me, and share with a friend if there's something you think that someone you know might get out of this. Wishing you peace and health. Thank you for being here.